Where are women in times of war? Women at War and its Aftermath is a new podcast where we explore the stories of women who fight and mobilize for what they believe in. What does it mean to be an agent in war or in peace? How might women's activism and involvement in politics take many forms? The first series focuses on stories of women in the Maoist People's War in Nepal. My name is Hanna Ketola and I'm a researcher based in London, originally from Finland.
Hi, I'm Swastika Kosoju and I'm also currently based in London, working as a consultant in international development. I originally come from Nepal.
My mother used to worry and warn me that going to the party invites death. They convinced me saying everything possible day and night. My mother guessed rightly that those people are coming to tempt me. I used to deny all that, but I used to feel excited about it.
Hello everyone and welcome back to our fourth episode. In today's episode, we turn to explore stories of women who fought in the Maoist People's Liberation Army, or else we can call them PLA, including Sarika and Anar, who participated in the Maoist movement. In 1996, the CPNM, Communist Party of Nepal Maoist, launched its People's War, waged against the government and what its instigators saw as over 200 years of feudal exploitation. The movement drew most of its cadres from the rural youth and historically marginalized ethnic and caste groups. It also mobilized women in unprecedented numbers. So Hannah, could you tell us a little bit more about the women's participation in the Maoist movement?
Yes, so from the beginning, the Maoist movement called for women to participate in their own liberation through political work in the party's student or women's wings, as well as in the battlefield in both support and combat roles. Women became key protagonists in the People's War, with most estimates of women's participation in the PLA at 30 to 40%. The mass recruitment of women in political and fighting roles was ideologically justified by an elaborate set of discourses and practices, what could be called martial feminism, geared towards rationalizing women's involvement in activities traditionally reserved for men. The main ideologist of women's liberation within the CPNM was Hishila Yami, alias Comrade Parvati. Comrade Parvati, an architect by training, was never directly involved in combat activities or in the training of the PLA combatants. During the war, she was a Central Committee member of the CPNM and the head of ANVA-R, the All Nepal Women's Association Revolutionary. To give you an insight into the feminist discourse the movement propagated, let's listen to an extract from Comrade Parvati's writings. Here, she describes how participation in the PLA has transformed women in both essence and form.
In form, it has totally undressed them from their feudal frills to functional unisex dress. It has transformed her from an anonymous domestic slave to a very visible, rebellious professional fighter. Earlier, she had no idea of time, slogging from dawn to past midnight. Today, she is recording time while planting the time bomb. Earlier, she could only pull others' hair. Today, she is teaching her to pull the triggers of guns. Earlier, she only shed her menstrual blood. Today, she is bleeding to throw away monarchy system. From an illiterate woman, she has become literate with enriched vocabulary of ideological and military terminologies. Thus, PLA has enabled village women to be more modern and educated than urban women. At a practical level, it has made it possible for women to take flight from kitchen to communism.
When I read Parvati's writings, I was struck by the highly evocative language and the kinds of binaries she invokes between a domestic slave and rebellious professional fighter, illiterate village woman, and a modern educated urban woman. And there exists a very interesting feminist scholarship that discusses the representations of women in Maoist discourses in Nepal. And I would strongly recommend, for example, the work by Marie Lecomte-Tilloun, Poonam Yadav, Ina Charkevich, and Laurent Geyer, amongst others. But what I wanted to highlight here is that Parvati's depiction of an uneducated, non-literate village woman tied to her home and the saucepan, who joins the PLA and goes through an extraordinary journey, has been contested by research into the varied backgrounds and multiple trajectories through which women joined the movement and the PLA. For example, this homogeneous construct ignores that a considerable proportion of women who joined the PLA were high school students who had often received a political education from an early age, and teenagers who were not yet married with a family to look after. What is important to grasp here, I think, is the very specific socioeconomic context in which the CPNM was mobilizing its cadres. The movement targeted rural areas that had been passed by the processes of national modernization and development. The deep urban-rural rift that had continued to grow since the 1980s was accompanied by the construction of a negative identity for rural Nepal as backward and underdeveloped, propagated through the Nepali education system. Yet, nationwide practices of discrimination meant that the rural youth had very limited options to explore alternative futures, with very few passing the prestigious school leaving certificate, SLC, exam that was required to access employment opportunities in urban areas. This resulted in a contradictory situation, with these same youths held back by a lack of opportunity being encouraged by their education system to lead the unified developing Nepali nation in its path towards progress. Tapping into these grievances and contradictions, the Maoist movement offered an alternative version of modernity, one where the rural youth was positioned at the center stage. In the ideology of Nepal's Maoists, armed struggle was conceived as the only route to carry out social transformation and therefore conceptualized as moral, a just war. Within this vision, violence was framed in the narrative of the salvation of the country, and the young women and men who joined the movement were positioned as those charged with the salvation of all.
Yes, and going back to Parvati's quote, I do agree about how the Maoist revolution brought women out of their households and the domestic sphere into more public space. I think the movement itself empowered more women to break down boundaries and not to conform to the society's expectations. And I also think that the women who participated do feel like they were empowered by the movement in being able to gain access over resources and power. It made them feel that they were all involved in a fight for the greater good, to break the caste inequality and discrimination. Also, that was one of the major motivations for them to join the Maoist army. But I think we also need to recognize that as the movement targeted rural youths, many of the young people who joined, including young women, were in fact children who were still in school. So I think we need to discuss the issue of forced recruitment as well here.
Yes, and thanks Svastika for mentioning this from the outset. A controversial aspect of the Maoist movement was its targeted focus on young people, including the so-called kidnapping of entire school classes and taking them to remote areas for several days of political education. This leading to charges by human rights organizations that the Maoists violated child rights by using school as a ground for recruitment. And at the height of their recruitment drive, the CPNM also ran a campaign called One House, One Maoist, where the element of forced recruitment was clearly present, with every house obligated to provide one member to the movement. But in my research, my premise was that the reasons why people residing in rural Nepal joined the movement cannot be reduced to coercion or indeed to the structural factors of the socioeconomic context I highlighted earlier. The stories that emerged when I met the women who had joined the movement were much more complicated than that. On the first day of conducting interviews, Pramila and I arrived at a mass gathering organized by the so-called Baidia faction of the Maoist party in Nepal's southern plains. The gathering took place in a district of Navalparasi, in a town that continued to be a Maoist stronghold in 2013. We had traveled on a bus from Kathmandu to Navalparasi the previous day and through Pramila's contacts met up with a high-level ex-PLA commander based in the district. She told us to go to a mass gathering taking place in a nearby town the next day. She said that there we would be able to meet some women who had been in the PLA. When we arrived in the morning heat, a small stage was being built for speeches. Before the program started, a woman greeted me with a Maoist salute, Lal Salam, and introduced herself as Asmita. She explained that she lived nearby and would be happy to talk. When we were sitting on the floor of the room that Asmita was renting, more women started to arrive, many of them with young children. It turned out that all 5 women present had been in the PLA and had been contacted by the district-level party official who had told them to come and meet us. This was a surprise for both me and Pramila. For the rest of the day, we conducted interviews in that hot, stifling room, taking breaks to go and buy drinks for everyone and to entertain the children. I was elated, as I had not expected to meet all these women on that day. I was very eager to hear about their engagement in the Maoist movement. And as my research was about agency and activism in the post-war context, I had all these questions ready about how the women were currently involved in politics, how they were active, and how they were mobilizing and still in contact with the party. But all my questions about politics were met with frustration or even anger.
म राजनीतिबाट थाकिसके. I'm tired of politics.
राजनीतिको लागि मैले धेरै नै गरिसके. I have done enough for politics.
मलाई अब राजनीतिमा केही चासो छैन. I am no longer interested in politics.
I was not sure what to do, or whether I understood correctly what was going on with my very basic Nepali. Pramila was translating here and there and furiously writing notes in English for me as we listened closely. For the rest of the day, whilst the party program was in progress only a short walk away, the women sat for hours talking about the grievances they had towards their leaders and commanders. It appeared that they had no intention to go and listen to their speeches. What I started to realize then, when meeting Sarika, Anar, Asmita and the others on that day, was that stories about being a women ex-PLA fighter were much, much more complicated than I had imagined. These encounters slowly started to shift my research agenda towards trying to understand what it means to be tired of politics and what is at stake when women ex-fighters appear to be moving away from collective mobilization and party activities.
For most of the women, becoming involved really did happen at a very young age. So these are the women who have given up their most productive years to the movement. And I say productive in terms of, completing an education, getting a job, income generating, and so on. So all these years, they have spent fighting in the war and becoming politically active. It also means that they built their lives around the whole Maoist movement. They were motivated by dreams of emancipation and also the opportunity to create a more just and equal society. So when they talk about being, tired of politics, we need to see why that change or shift has occurred. But to understand what is at stake in these expressions, and to understand what is going on when women ex-fighters appear to move away from politics, we need to ask first, what did being part of the PLA mean for these women? How did they conceptualize the movement? And how did they first get involved? Here we meet Sarika. Sarika was originally from Baglung, one of the districts in rural Nepal, and she had been a foot soldier in the PLA, joining the army shortly before the peace agreement. She talked at length about how she got involved in the Maoist movement at a really young age, and how she supported the party in various ways before joining the PLA.
म ढाट्दिन है. मेरो सबै माइत परिवारमा सबैजना कांग्रेस छन्. मेरो भाउजू र आमा लिएर मामाहरू, everybody in my family and clan are Congress party. I used to work in Congress in the beginning too. Later it all changed. One day there was a Maoist program and everything I felt changed. Then I left Congress and started working for the Maoist Students' Union. My parents and others were not happy, so they tried to convince me. Everybody in the family is Congress. Why did you join the Maoist? They asked. But I kept denying and kept on working. At the time of emergency, I helped the party members as much as I could, as the age of 12 to 13. I used to help them, carrying food and all. Army used to chase us. Those who I helped have risen so high in the party now. Look where I am. I used to walk around with them all the time. They lured me a lot while joining the party, almost 6 days and 6 nights. One of the party cadre sisters used to come and sleep with me in the same bed. She did all that. My mother used to worry and warn me that going to the party invites death. They convinced me saying everything possible day and night. My mother guessed rightly that those people are coming to tempt me. I used to deny all that, but I used to feel excited about it. It was a rainy night. My class 8 exam was running. War was going on then. I had helped the party to manage many things for 2 years. Later, people started saying I worked for a party, and as our home is close to market, armies started coming home again and again to trouble. Maoists used to hide many books at our home. Mother used to help them even without joining the party as she was against going to party. Everybody started doubting me then. My mother said, everybody has started doubting you. You leave home and go Kathmandu to stay and study with their sister. But she was only my cousin's sister, so I decided not to. I ran out from home at a rainy night at 12.
Sarika then described how her family tried to convince her to return and how she finally joined the PLA after first working in the area committee.
मेरो बाबाले धेरै कोसिस गर्नुभयो मलाई घर फकाउन अनि त परिवारबाट धेरै दबाब आएपछि पार्टीको कार्यकर्ताहरूले My father tried a lot to make me return home. Then party seniors also requested me to return because of the family pressure. I was not supposed to join PLA, but it was mandatory quota of 4 people to be sent from every area. In the beginning, I was not on the list, but the person who was scheduled to join PLA escaped in the night. So there was confusion about who will join the PLA to replace him. So I requested the commanders that I will go for the quota. The commanders first resisted because of my young age, but my height was good enough to impress them. So they decided to send me in the quota and I joined PLA. When I saw those cadres carrying weapons, I used to feel like going into the war immediately. They gave nice farewell to us.
She further goes on to explain how it turned out that soon after she joined, the peace agreement was made between the CPNM and the then government.
म जनमुक्ति सेनामा भर्ना भएपछि युद्धमा भाग लिन गइन। करिब 2 महिनापछि पार्टी त युद्ध विराममा गयो। मैले धेरै काम After I joined PLA, I didn't go to participate in the war. After 2 months of joining, the party went for a ceasefire. I had done a lot of work in the community of that area, but peace arrived after 2 months of me joining the PLA. Only after peace was restored, my family asked me to return home. My parents said that I have had enough and that I joined the PLA, I participated in the war, and now that there is peace, I would have to resume my study from the point I had left and continue to get an education. I also told them that I had survived being in the war and also being a Maoist, and that they need not worry about me anymore. They don't have to worry about the peace process anymore. I told my mother not to worry about me as there are other sons and daughters that they can worry about. My mother said no matter what happens, the youngest child is always the dearest for the parents and for the relatives. But I replied I hadn't stopped anyone else doing politics. I would do my own and the relatives would do their own. In the same way, I fell in love, then got married. Later came 2 kids, what else?
You know, listening to Sarika's story, I can definitely relate to the kind of experiences she had. I think most of the youths of today, who were young children while the Maoist revolution was happening, can strike a connection with her story. For some children in the rural areas, the experience is very similar. Even while growing up, and when I was 12 or 13 years old, the same age as Sarika was, I do remember the Maoist cadres marching into our schools with guns and just barging into our classes saying that they have come to inform us about who they are and what they were doing. They also distributed some forms so that we, the students, can become a member of their movement. I do remember our teachers back then had briefed us about the current situation and had also prepared us by giving us strict instructions to write down fake names in case they asked us to fill out any forms or anything. And that is exactly what happened. You know, when I look back at that experience, even today, I can feel the chills down my spine because it was quite a tense moment. And I can imagine how the rural children in their schools might have been influenced to join the Maoist, as rural areas were a stronghold of the Maoist community. Me and my classmates were lucky enough that we were briefed beforehand and were made aware. Otherwise, who knows where we would be? The Maoist revolutionaries would come to our school quite often, threatening and demanding for donations. And our school principal and administration couldn't do anything but to donate. It was fear that gripped people. But I also know that the reaction from urban people, which was mostly fear, might not necessarily have been the same for the children living in the rural areas.
Thank you so much, Swastika, for sharing your experience. One of the things that struck me about Sarika's story as well was this intricate reflection around her motivation to join and the tactics of persuasion used by the Maoists. Her parents also entered the story prominently, worrying about her, persuading her not to get involved, and expressing their love for her. To me, Sarika's story offers a glimpse into the complexities of having to navigate different challenges that come from joining a revolutionary movement, including involving her parents and family and forging her identity within the movement she has started to feel so strongly about. What her reflections also bring to the fore is how it is difficult to pin down the most important motivations for joining. Was it the initial excitement when seeing the Maoist political and cultural programs, the cadres carrying guns, or was it that once she was involved to an extent, it became increasingly difficult to stay in her home area? Because there is definitely this threat of violence from the part of the army present in the story and the references to everyone doubting her. I also wanted to point out that Sarika positioned herself as someone who had worked hard and long for the movement, even if in the end she did not end up participating in battles. And I think this is crucially important. The question of who is recognized as an ex-combatant is always a contested domain in a post-war context. And we know from the wealth of feminist research and activism that often women who contributed to armed groups are not recognized as combatants in the war's aftermath, including in internationally led peacebuilding programs. We will discuss these issues also in the next episode, but I wanted to mention this because in our meeting, Sarika, even if not having gone to battle, positioned herself as an ex-PLA and as a fighter. And it was from this position that she engaged with our questions. And often after the interviews, the women I met would mention how it had been important that we had come to meet them as ex-PLA, not as conflict-affected women or conflict victims, but as people who had contributed to the PLA.
Yes, and to further explore the kind of context in which the women Hannah had met joined the movement, let's listen to Anar. She was also present on the same day in Nawalparasi. She was originally from Kalikot, a remote hill district from the far western region that had become one of the Maoist strongholds during the war. She had been a sub-company commander and unlike Sarika had fought in many battles, as she told us.
हामी सबै ठाउँमा गएर लड्यौं. रोल्पा, रुकुम, सल्यान. We fought everywhere. Rolpa, Rukum, Salyan, Dang, and others. I fought everywhere and every way possible.
Anar described the situation in which she had joined the movement as such.
अब यस्तो हो के जुन बेलामा अब त्यो बेलाको एउटा अर्कै स्थिति थियो हैन किनभने एकदम उत्पीडन. See, it is like this. At that time the situation was different because at that time there was a lot of oppression from the government. That was the condition then. Even when we used to go to school, we did not get to study because the police would come there as well. And even in the villages and the rural places, there was a lot of oppression and domination. And then there was a situation where our grandfathers used to get beaten up so much that they would bleed at times. So when we used to go to school, they used to surround our schools. And when we were at home, they used to surround that too. And when they used to do like that, there were no men and boys in the village. Everyone used to go to the jungle to hide. So when that happened and when this continued for some time, the situation was as such that we could not live in peace in our homes as well. So our uncles, brothers, everyone left the house and went. And at that time, one of our brothers became a martyr as well. He was one of our neighbors and nearby family member. And that time, people were more focused on having revenge for the life of martyr. It was kind of giving respect to the martyr. And after all of that happened, then I also went into the movement. It was kind of due to compulsion and the feeling of taking revenge. Hence, I got involved in the Maoist movement.
You know, this feeling of revenge towards the state was a crucial instigator for many young people to join the movement. The conflict period had a lot of disappearances, abductions from both the state and the Maoist sides. The people living in the remote areas of the country had to survive and continue living in a very difficult circumstance. I still remember the capital having curfews every night. People were not allowed to walk in groups or at night time. But the situation of city areas was not comparable at all to the reality of the rural village areas. It was a tough period for the villages of rural Nepal, and hence the influence of Maoist movement was strong, with many youths motivated to join because of revenge or because they are doing it for the family honor.
Yes, I agree that from Anna's story we do get a glimpse of the context of enduring and witnessing violence in which she joined the movement. But I also wanted to reflect a little bit more on the point about revenge. What struck me was how in Anna's story her decision to join the movement is rendered meaningful through the Maoist discourse of sacrifice and martyrdom. Anna notes how at that time people were more focused on taking revenge for the life of a martyr. It is well documented that as a revolutionary movement, Maoism in Nepal was formulated in sacrificial terms by its own actors from the outset, and the sacrificial dimension provided real momentum to the People's War. Veneration of martyrdom was a central aspect of the movement, martyrs becoming guardians of memorials built in their honor and heroes in Maoist books and poetry. As Anna reflects, this was the situation at that time, at the time of war. So she is reflecting back about her motivations to join, and thus so in a situation where at the time of our meeting, the armed struggle is no longer ongoing. It is important to keep this in mind when listening to all these stories that emerged through our encounters.
Yes, that is so true. What I keep wondering is how the stories about joining the movement might have been different if you had met Anar and Sarika prior to the peace agreement when the armed struggle was still going on. Or for example, at the time of the high hopes of the CPNM's electoral success in 2008, when the party had won a large majority and was leading the government, and when the newly established Constituent Assembly abolished the over 240 years old monarchy in its first sitting.
Yes, exactly. And in the next 2 episodes, we will talk more about what exactly was the political situation like in which Pramila and I met the women ex-PLA fighters in 2013. How the political context of the movement had shifted since the peace agreement in 2006. What were the grievances the women ex-fighters expressed in relation to the party leaders, commanders, as well as the international actors engaged in peace building? And what it meant to be an ex-PLA fighter? How moving away from party activities and collective mobilization might be one way of pursuing this political subjectivity, a way to express agency in the aftermath of war.
This is Women at War and Its Aftermath, a podcast about the untold stories of women who fight and mobilise for what they believe in. The podcast is co-hosted by Swastika Kazaju and Hannah Kettler and co-produced and co-edited with Lizzie Ellen Aisha Khan. The voices for the stories are provided by Ankita Manadur, Divya Tapamagar, Manita Shrestha and Abhishek Shrestha. This podcast series was made possible by funding from the Economic and Social Science Research Council and King's College London. Thank you so much for listening, and please rate and review us on your preferred podcast provider. It really helps us reach more listeners with our inspiring stories of women at war.